Thanks a million for yeah, having the chat and everything. And
Not
yeah,
at
good to
all.
see you. There's not enough of it. Well, it's creating something. Yeah, I think there needs to be more of it, especially in the Irish context, and more nuance and focusing on the solutions, you know?
Yeah. I was at these uh, things this week organised by Francis and Irving and Henry. I've got Henry's surname now, but they're called the Land Talks. It was really nice, just like really fantastic small little talks about land. And yeah, it's fantastic. Just as you say, like it's the most important topic. Why aren't we talking about it more?
Yes, definitely. And I suppose like I'm back in Ireland. I'm back in my hometown, you know,
Mhm.
and it's not exactly a beacon of, you know, the arts and innovation or anything like that. So I think the podcasting platform is going to give me a chance to really connect with people in places like London and Los Angeles and wherever,
Anywhere, yeah,
anywhere.
yeah.
Yes, that's the
Yeah.
beauty of it. And I think, yeah, there is a certain potential to being in a very small town in terms of like your there's great options to apply it.
Exactly. Everything that's happening is happening there. So yeah, that'd be interesting actually. Kind of. But you should do it. You should do a thing just about how the land system touches. Where are you? Where are you in
Athlone
Ireland?
is the name
Oh,
of
Athlone, right.
the town. Yeah,
Yeah,
right in the middle.
nice. Yeah, right in the middle. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, that's what your podcast should be. Should just be like loads of stuff about how the land's in a really specific place, just because that's where you are. I
Yeah.
know, that's possibly a terrible idea, but I
No,
just
but it is really interesting. It is really interesting to just focus on one kind of small
yeah,
location and like to focus on a very small even user group or things like
yeah,
that.
because there's so many dimensions to how it shows up in our lives,
Yeah.
um, and all the different ways and languages around it that we use it that we don't always tie those threads together. So something
Yeah,
can be said for that.
it's such a cool topic, and I'm actually thinking about. I won't go into it too much because there's not too much time, but I'm thinking about setting up a little platform, to really test an idea in a way that's, okay, how can you do a pilot where you kind of solve the problem for the person who has got the lowest amount of power,
Yeah,
and if you can
nice.
do
Yeah,
it for them, or if that person, or I'm even using myself as a guinea pig, and you know, if you haven't got a high income and you know you haven't got an existing property, you know, you're kind of at the
yeah,
lower end of the spectrum,
yeah. I think I
and
always
if you
think
can
and we've
solve it
talked
for
about it.
someone like that, do you know what I mean? Then I think that's a
Yeah,
really
no,
interesting
I
place to
always
start from.
thought that when we've talked about this before, how it's a fundamentally useful prism to see the world through is the landed and the landless, right? Because actually, as you say, power it's about power and powerlessness, which is exactly the language which is largely missing from a lot of housing conversations, right? The very fact that we call them housing conversations, that and a housing policy wonks, and neither of us are not that entirely, but we'll tend to use very different language, like we'll tend to talk about um, like housing standards or affordability ratios or things like that, whereas actually when you speak to almost anyone who in various different ways is at the rough end of the system, they use really different language, and the language they use is the language of power. It's the language of feeling frustrated, and stressed, and just kind of railing at the sheer blatant unfairness of it all. And that's not just like people living in poverty, but there was the stories there was a good story on the BBC a little while ago of a lady who'd been evicted by her landlord on Christmas Eve and couldn't get a house because she had a child, and all the landlords were like, no, we're not interested in families with children for whatever reason. um
Messier.
and yeah, and yeah, like same, conversations where people say, oh yeah, I can't put up pictures on my walls with blue tack because if the blue tack doesn't come off, my landlord will use that as an excuse to keep my deposit. Right. So that, like, that language of power and powerlessness, even in apparently apparently everyday small things like that. That's actually the language that people use, because that's
And there's
actually how the system works.
yeah, it's getting to the truth of the matter. And
Mm.
this is something that usually artists do, professionally or something like that, but there's such a strong potency to that, emotionally,
Yeah,
and everyone can relate to that as well.
yeah,
You know, but when you talk about things like children and Christmas Eve, and it's,
yeah.
yeah,
What's funny
there's an
though,
emotional
exactly.
resonance with that, isn't there?
Well, totally there is, but also not only that, but as you say, it's the truth of the matter. Like even when you might read an article like that, um, you might still be tempted to say, "Oh, that's an egregious abuse by one particular person or whatever," in a system that otherwise is fundamentally, it's just to do with housing, right? But always, but that's not it at all. Like, as you and I have spent, you know, hours and weeks and months and years of our lives drilling into what this system is and where it came from. And when you actually learn the history of this system and where it comes from, you realize, oh, no, no, okay, it literally is a system of power. That's what it always was. It's what it was created as. So, and of course, in a way, those people are are right. There's another really good example I'm thinking of. Years ago, there was a Channel 4 interviewed a homeless man who was sleeping on the steps of, I can't remember the name of the church. It's just near Broadcasting House and in London, and it's profoundly eloquent. And what he was saying was, look, you know what? I can live without shelter. I can even live without food, etc. I can get by. I can survive those things. But what I can't live without is just a basic measure of dignity, a basic level of recognition that something, that this is kind of completely unfair, or whatever, of being treated as a human and having a kind of
The
equal
social
rights as anyone
context of
else. Yeah,
that kind of,
yeah, yeah. I've completely killed that. It was much more eloquent. You can probably
yeah.
find the video online.
And that's really interesting as well, because there's an activist that I was recently put in touch with, and she put out just a reel on Instagram, and she was really articulate in saying that actually most people don't have the moral courage to stand up for other people's rights when it's not the social norm.
That's right. I think there's definitely truth in that, and then there's also a layer which is when it comes to land and housing, it's invisible, right? It's all around us. It's the system we've always been in, um, and I always use the analogy of it's a bit like water to a fish, right? And therefore, because of that, um, people who are in a relatively good position in housing or a less bad position, so maybe you own your own home, might be with a mortgage still, or you might own home outright. You forget, you can't really fully comprehend what it feels like to be um to be completely landless and to be steeped in debt and having that degree of precarity, because you just forget, like your brain just, you're too busy living. Like like property is the thing right at the bottom of everyone's personal security, etc. So it becomes invisible once you have a certain amount of kind of privilege in that system. But also, yeah, it's the bottom of it. It sits almost beyond political principle, or to put it another way, as I often do, everyone is a progressive until you come for their housing, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
We've talked about in the work on Fairhold, the kind of meme cartoon is the perfect meme cartoon. It's like, hands up if you'd like housing to be more affordable. Everyone puts their hands up, right? Hands up if you'd like your property to go down in value. Pitchforks come out.
yeah. But anyway, I suppose like this topic as well, I mean, I think we are people who we really care enough about this stuff enough to really make sacrifices to really delve into it. And it
I
took
don't know
me a
if we're
long,
making sacrifices, but we definitely care about it. Like
well,
we're
to really,
like,
to actively choose to pursue something.
well, once I always quote that there's a great Aaron Schwartz quote about once you see bad systems, you can't unsee them.
Yeah. I feel for myself there is a bit of a sacrifice, but at the same time I feel like I can't not do it. It's this weird obsession slash calling.
Yeah,
And so yeah, it's a sacrifice, but it's not a sacrifice. It feels like I'm meant to be doing this and I
yeah,
want to be doing it. But it's you do have to go against the grain, especially in something like a profession like architecture, which requires long training,
yeah.
and the realities of going against the grain in that kind of a very conservative profession, you
Yeah,
know.
and it's worth acknowledging here that the way, going back to your thing about human nature and how we navigate these kind of these deeply screwed up, unjust systems, and I think we all actually have a sense that it's unfair, um, but we sort of look the other way, right? We just don't talk about it, and I think again that's the whole point. And one of the things I've written about a lot is like there is no one has a good argument in favor or defense of the current way we do property, land and property. Because there is not one, right? Either from the left or the right. So if you believe in free markets, then the kind of this extractive rent system is completely abhorrent to you. If you believe in strong, durable communities, then of course it's abhorrent to you. If you believe in human rights, it's abhorrent to you. If you believe in um, like any like people's welfare, right? So kind of so like conventional things that you'd focus on the left, right? So these systems, they persist not through principle but through conspiracies of silence, right? Because it's inconvenient, because essentially vested interest. We are all in some way, and there are no good guys or bad guys in this system, by the way. We're all to some extent vested in this system. So if you're an architect, the reality of it is architects often feel very split, because a lot of architects will be smart enough to see that this is what's actually shaping the environment in which they work, and compassionate enough to see how harmful it is in terms of they want to be building better housing or more affordable housing and so forth. But at the same time, to a large extent, the architecture industry heavily works for this system. That's literally where architects' money comes from. A huge chunk of it is working for property developers,
Yeah.
for example.
So the reality of breaking out of that as someone who's trained in architecture it's going to be difficult. And I think as well, there's almost like part of this is beyond our control. Like we all have our own different paths that we are faced with and that we navigate. And, maybe my path actually will be very different to yours. And
Mm.
you know what I mean? Like it's easy to look at someone and think, okay, what they're doing is brilliant, but we create our path by walking it. And I think each path is going to be quite unique, depending on personalities and things like that. So I'm really interested in this as a designer, I suppose, and how we navigate that path. Especially, I think I think it's especially difficult sometimes. I imagine it's the same for someone who's trained as a doctor, and you go through such rigorous training, and you only see one kind of very, very established type of profession that's going to give you the
Mm.
security and the comfort you think you need.
Yeah.
But actually, yeah, to break out of that, I think is really, really
I mean,
exciting, but also slightly terrifying.
but scary, yeah. I mean, that said, it's probably easier in architecture than medicine, because whilst I'm sure we don't pay doctors and nurses enough money, generally speaking, there is a pretty stable obvious professional need. As Cedric Price said, it's pretty obvious to see how doctors, dentists, and butchers help people, right? Whereas architecture, actually, is not at all stable. It's not a well-paid profession at all. It's a consistently poor performer. One of the things I'm always saying is that actually, if you were the architecture industry right now, there's uh, uh, it, like there's plenty of reasons why you would do this out of pure business interests, right? Because this system is not working for you, right?
Yeah, it is a pretty kind of precarious career path. But weirdly, when I was in school, like in secondary school, career guidance teachers were kind of pushing me towards it. And it does have this kind of air of prestige. And when you look up, what
Yeah,
salaries are, they're quite high. So you think, oh, this is great. But then you get into it, you
You
realize
haven't looked up salaries in a while. They're not that high. I mean, it's all relative, isn't it? But yeah, exactly right. I experienced the same when I was at training for architecture. It's sort of it's included in a list alongside doctor, lawyer, these highly sort of respected professions. Um, and don't get me wrong, I love architecture and think it's incredibly important. That's why that I'm doing all the things that I'm doing. But um, at the same time, we have to recognize, well, it's not, right? How much surgery is not done by surgeons? Close to zero. How many buildings are not designed by architects? It's about 95% ish, at least.
yeah. So you graduated around the time of the financial crash in 2008.
Mm.
And I mean, that's quite exciting in a way. And, because you're kind of forced to really grapple with this. And
Yeah, no, it definitely forced the issue because and the interesting thing for me is because I was working, it meant so architecture education, as you know, you do these years out, right? So you sort of do undergrad and then you go and work for a year or 2 years and then you go back and do your masters. And so in the my first time those years out, I had this just lovely job and it was really great. But what was really interesting is it was during the boom time, right? And there
your
was
money going
loads.
around.
So this is 2006. There was loads of money going around. What was really interesting was that I'd meet up with friends in the pub, and they hated it in a way because they were like, "Oh, as I trained as an architect because I wanted to go out there and make buildings better." And everyone had gone out into the world going, "I'm going to make these beautiful buildings that are super zero carbon and like affordable homes and generous community things and spaces and these beautiful works of art almost." And yet, what they actually found was they have a client who's telling them to make the ceilings lower and to take the balconies off and put less insulation in the walls. And I was like, guys, this is fascinating because it means we don't really understand the economics of the system that we're working within. So a lot of people did leave architecture at that time, but I'd already, to some extent, made up my mind that I wanted to try and do more to understand the system and then say what could we do to redesign it. My masters, I went back and I wrote a dissertation called Form Follows Finance, which was about exactly what you think it was about. But for sure, then when I graduated right into a massive recession in 2009, it helped, right? It helped force the
Yeah.
issue because it just wasn't an option for me to then go back to the company I'd been working for before, because like most architecture firms, they were shrinking.
Yeah. And I wonder, because I know you studied at Sheffield and you're around
Mm.
people like Jeremy Till. And I do kind of think, I mean, about the influences that the people you're working with and that are teaching you had around you. And I do wonder if Sheffield influenced you that way because it wouldn't be the typical architecture school. It's a bit more lefty, I think, compared to.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, don't get me wrong. Jeremy Till was brilliant. It was, I had him as a tutor for a year, and he was just amazing. And definitely, I think that one of the cool things about him though was that he wasn't like, oh, programming you to be a lefty. He was making you think for yourself, right, and making you think your own path. One of the things I often think about this is that, oddly enough, if I'd gone to another school, I might have been lefty. But in Sheffield, I wasn't. Sheffield, I was like,
Made you interrogate and really
no,
think
yeah,
about.
Sheffield, I was probably like full out there, mad, like free market neoliberal or something. Like, so most of these political categories are nonsense. Actually, they're secondhand received wisdom that don't really make sense that hard when you think about them. Like, so there was definitely a thing in architecture where there'd be a kind of, oh, well, we really like working on, you know, in architecture, this is my project. It's all about, it's like a creche made of hemp or something. And it's great, but a lot of it was actually aesthetics. They weren't actually engaging in the hard nosed stuff of the finance and the legal system that was underpinning and driving all these things, and in particular the land and property system. And that I found very odd that you got a lot of, and by the way, it also makes me love architects, is that actually people criticize them for being bad at business, but in a way I kind of love that they're bad at business, because in a way that's their professional duty coming out, because architects want to be making great places for people. You know, and they then get frustrated by the system, but then it baffles me why people weren't and aren't doing more to properly understand that system, rather than just rhetorically talking about it and complaining about it.
Yeah. Well, I think architects, they understand the huge benefit to not just your well-being, but like once you've experienced and really great architecture, it's really hard to go back to
Right.
living in really shitty buildings. And architects
Exactly.
really
Yeah.
understand this and the impact
Yeah.
that has collectively. So I
Exactly
think
right.
it's a really beautiful thing. It's not
Yeah.
superficial.
Yeah.
And it's
Exactly
also,
right.
it's not just aesthetics, but it's really about design around how people interact together. And you know, there is evidence around how certain high-rise buildings that haven't really been designed for communities, that you know, things like crime are increased and isolation and all of these kind of
Exactly right.
things.
No, I mean, and by the way, this is a really important thing, because yeah, you're exactly right. Architects find themselves trying to be the defenders and the stewards for that knowledge, but often not able to prove it or articulate it. Right. Now, there is a whole other conversation which has nothing to do with land system, etc., but actually, which is just talking to do with knowledge. There's actually amazing, astounding amount of data out there about this stuff, and actually, architecture as a profession should have been and should be much more on that. Like, you know, just about more higher ventilated spaces, like improved cognition, for example, and that's partly to do with off-gassing and all sorts of stuff. I remember reading a mad one that people, if you sit within 7 meters of a window in your office, you sleep 45 minutes longer at night on average, right? So some of these things are quantitatively proven. Only the Americans would discover, because only the Americans would sit someone more than 7 meters from a window. But like there is a huge body of knowledge out there but actually what the other side to this is, this recognition that working within an environment which was literally pulling in the other direction, right? So what's the point being able to prove that higher ceilings improve people's mental health, and daylight improve people's mental health, if your client wants to do the exact opposite, right? There's there's a kind of straightforward contradiction kind of built into the entire system, which is like, if we really care about those things. So, but I'll put it another way. What was actually happening at that time is that architects not necessarily having the language to articulate this thing that they knew about how important the environment is to people's well-being, that they would fall back on this word quality, which just means nothing, right? And and at the time, so particularly back in sort of when I say that sort of time, 2006, 2007, 2009, up to that crash in 2008, that was the predominant language. So you had this organization called CABE, which was a really well-meaning organization, but really its defense of that knowledge didn't, in my view, and other people might push back on this, but as an outsider, I don't think it amounted to much more than long reports and design reviews, which just amorphously defended this concept of quality and tried to argue for quality within a system that was inherently geared to reduce quality. And there's a point in that system where we say, well, guys, this makes no sense. Why are we doing this? At what point do we realize that our job is to understand that system and to redesign that system? And so begin to say, well, actually, what would a set of systems behind the way that we make and own and plan places look like if we actually wanted them to be geared towards quality? I would say it's a bit like harnessing yourself to an ox that's pulling in the exact opposite direction.
Yeah.
And they pull on these ropes and say, we believe in quality. It's like, well, mate, you are in the wrong game because the industry you work in does not believe in quality. And there were lots of really good government reports. One of my favorites was one called the Calcutt Review. There have been various ones since, the Letwin Review since, that have spelled out exactly how the house building industry works, what the incentives are in that industry. The Calcutt Review was brilliant because it was written by John Calcutt, who was a former house builder himself, who said this industry does not exist to serve the public interest. It exists to serve its shareholders. It isn't, even though these companies are called house builders, they're actually land traders. Their business model consists of buying land, getting planning permission, building homes ultimately as cheaply as they can, and then selling those homes into the mortgage industry. And therefore, those companies, and these are perfectly good people, these are not bad, greedy people, these are perfectly good people in bad systems. But those companies have a direct incentive to build, ultimately, in effect, the worst housing they can, or certainly to reduce, to squeeze, to plant fewer trees, to make the ceilings lower, to take things out. So we say, well, actually, the incentives in this system are fundamentally wrong, and you can't regulate those away. No matter how many reports you write about quality, it's not going to do anything about that. So at what point is our professional duty to think about rewiring that? And that, for me, was where I then started to go. I wrote a thing called a right to build.
Yes.
That's a very obvious place. A pretty good foundational principle is, if you want good places, the best people to commission, don't have to physically build it themselves, i.e. to procure those places, will be the people, the families and communities who are going to live in those places, right? To pick an obvious example that I use all the time is, we all agree, right, that we need to put more insulation in the walls. Who is the one group who have a direct incentive to put more insulation in the walls? It's the people who are going to pay the heating bills.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really straightforward. So we as a country have signed up to say we want energy efficient homes. We want to achieve our carbon goals, 2050 carbon goals. And yet we spend all our time trying to regulate an industry that doesn't want to do that, to try and do it, but
Yeah.
not going, well, wait a minute, there's a massive other industry and huge groups of people out there who would actually, I would believe, would make a bigger and better basis for an industry, development industry, who do want to do that. And yet, why aren't we saying, how do we get land to these people? How do we make planning easier for these people?
Yes.
By which I mean, basically, people who are building places to live. So self-builders, custom builders, community builders, whatever you want to call them. Any sort of, or also any form of sort of non-profit house builder.
Yeah. I just wonder, like, have architects become a bit complacent around the topics that you're talking about linking the data around quality and well-being and health? Because, for a lot of the 20th century, we had great social housing, public housing,
Yeah.
so we have all these amazing examples, from people like Neve Brown, the Barbican, all these amazing places, great examples of incredible architecture. And if you go onto this website, themodernhouse.com, you can see a flat in the Barbican going for 2.25 million.
Yeah,
And
some
it's
serious real estate right there.
gorgeous interiors and architecture. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite maddening because, as an
Right,
architect,
but that's because architecture was working within the framework of the state and a
yeah,
series of systems. Um, and at that point, back in like the 70s, an amazingly high, the majority of architects actually worked in the public sector back then, which is crazy to think now. Um, but the and architects are often they are sometimes kind of nostalgic for that. But what I think generally architects haven't done is actually then dived into the detail of, okay, what changed? Where
yeah,
did that system go? Well, actually, there were some really specific things that changed to do with the way that land compulsory purchase laws work, and the fact that the public sector was a very active buyer, assembler of land. You had things like development corporations. There's lots of things along in the systems, but architects, because they tend to be, as I think Mem Koolhaas put it, architects are frozen by their love of frozen things. They tend to over focus on the hardware and under focus on the software. And actually, it's the software of those systems that actually
yes,
is what generates that. And that's in a way for me, the point was realizing, well, oh God, if we actually want to change that stuff, we have to turn our design attention as designers from the hardware to those systems, to the software of those systems. Whose job is that? Okay, it's no one's, so we better start trying to make it our job.
Yeah, and thank God you've delved into that and done the deep research, and then done also the incredible work in articulating that in a easy, concise way that people can understand. Because I think that is,
I
it's
mean, I
not.
haven't. That's generous of you, but I haven't. I should say, obviously, we're not the only ones doing it. There are, others who've been, writing about this and articulating that this is what architecture needs to be doing.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
actually, if you take, one of my favorite things, if you actually look back at the original charter of the RIBA, which is the original kind of contract that basically says architects get the term architect in exchange for something. It's a quid pro quo. And the thing that it's a quid pro quo for is, and the language is quite old fashioned, but it basically says you have responsibility for a body of knowledge. That's really interesting that the word knowledge is so foundational in that. So essentially the RIBA is responsible for a body of knowledge. So things like the stuff we're talking about, like the
the
health
legal
impacts of this
context.
design. Oh, right. So, but just like, hey, if you put this material in the walls, it's going to be poisoning people, etc.,
Okay.
etc.
Yeah.
And then the other thing alongside the responsibility of that body of knowledge, and the language is a bit old fashioned. It says something like being an art tending to the furtherance of it's not but whatever it is, but it's of society. But in as many words, what it says is that architects have a public duty to society in the built environment, and to the built environment, because that is a common environment in which we all have to spend our time. So what's really interesting about what it doesn't say anything about the business model. It doesn't say anything to do with designing buildings or drawing drawings of buildings or anything like that. It says, there's no reason why architects can't draw a drawing of a system just as well as they can draw whatever it takes. The actual foundational thing of what it means to be an architect is to have a public duty to society in the built environment. And I would argue we should just do whatever it takes to try and perform that duty.
Yeah, and that feels right, and to me, after someone who's gone through the training and is a citizen and who cares about this stuff. But it's not everyone is like that, is what I'm saying. I mean,
No,
it's okay, that's written in the thing,
no.
but like not
Yeah.
everyone really kind of embodies that or takes
No,
that on
because
board. A lot of
what
people
tends
follow the market.
what tends to happen to most of these institutions over time is they become like a bit more like a guild in its behavior, right? So it sort of represents a particular set of professional interests,
Yeah.
and says, oh yeah, we should, defend their fees or et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, no, these architecture bodies are not guilds. They are professional bodies, and at their best, it's when they're acting in that capacity, right? To actually not simply say, hey, you should hire architects more, but actually go, what can we do as a group of citizens to try and improve something. But I was, as you can tell, as you know, Neve, I was very influenced by Cedric Price books, much of which there aren't that many. But he had a wonderful thing about, he said, in the end, the ultimate last remaining justification for architecture is actually preventative health. Not just preventative physical health, but preventative mental health. And he added the rather indelicate words, how to stop society from topping itself. But yeah, that was like scribbled in a margin somewhere. But I feel like he got it about spot on.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. He seemed like very, very inventive in any of the work that I've seen that he was creating. I never really delved into him too much, but I really appreciate everything that you're kind of taking from him and bringing into your own work. And I mean, one thing that I think is really important to focus on in this whole situation that we're in currently as a society around architecture and building is that there actually would not be a housing crisis if we had a system where everyone had the access to a plot of land with planning
Right.
permission and infrastructure. So,
Right.
maybe, okay, in the influences of Cedric Price, let's start talking about that system and let's start building that system
Yeah, and I would say Cedric Price,
unapologetically.
he never really got that far, I don't think, or that far. That was so exciting. He was doing other things. He focused on other things.
Yeah.
But I exactly agree with you, and I think that's exactly the point, which is to say, yeah, and you can look backwards and say, well, why don't we have that system? And actually, as we've talked about, it has its roots in the feudal system. The Acts of Enclosure, etc. In Ireland, obviously has this really fascinating history, which is where, as you've studied, there were various bits of customary law that came that predated things.
I see it a bit more black and white. I think I see
Right.
the tool of colonization when we were under British
Right.
occupation was by making land, a system of land that was based in a communally owned system, transferring the rights to the individual, but was completely, they transformed the land system. We had a highly sophisticated land system here that was based on communally owned land where everyone had the right to a plot of land.
Right.
That was eradicated
Well,
as
but
part of the
also,
colonial project.
And by the way, England arguably
project.
had that in the common system, and a lot of places had that as part of their indigenous land systems. And as you say, a very particular developed thing that came from feudalism, where basically land and the ability to charge tax, i.e. rent on that land, was given into the hands of the powerful, and we sort of projected that everywhere.
So our
and by the way,
current models.
It's not an accident, by the way. I think I'm right in saying the 15 most unaffordable cities to live in the world today, unaffordability measured as in price of housing relative to incomes, are all in Britain or its former colonies. So America, Hong Kong, Canada, etc. Right?
This is
and that's not an accident.
Colonialism
right?
is completely linked to our today's housing crisis. Yeah,
for sure. Now, but what's also really interesting in the Irish context as well, right, is when you get into that and the history of, we spoke about this long ago, the surrender and regrant thing. It's this really like weirdly nuanced story where the English came over, and initially it was just like, oh, right, well, we're just going to basically take control here, but we won't upset the apple cart too much. What we'll do is you give up your land rights in your legal system, and we'll re-grant you land rights in our legal system, and therefore you kind of bring into our control. Now, I don't know exactly, as you say,
there's a few pieces as well I'd like to add into that, like part of that surrender regrant where they actually kidnapped the children of
right.
kings, the child who would become the king as part of that.
Right. To take that control, right? And then
the Irish didn't just decide.
Right. No, exactly.
And along with that, our language was destroyed. All of the legal texts were destroyed. It wasn't a clean thing of, here's a new system.
And also, there's the intention of the system, which, as you say, is pretty clear. And then there's also a whole bunch of problems which come in simply the execution of a system. Because when you create a system like that, which is inbuilt, basically rentier extraction, you can get power out of people, then the administrators of the surrender and regrant themselves became incredibly corrupt, right? And did these horrific abuses of power, because guess what, if you give someone that amount of power over other people, guess what's going to happen? So and I think
essentially the freehold is a legal mechanism to fund military campaigns.
Yeah, so this is the thing to kind of, we always, we do this, and we do this in the fail paper, is rewind. What is land ownership? Is one of those fascinating things. We live every day with the idea of land ownership. We're like, oh yeah, property ownership. It's it's huge. It's most of the economy. Come back to that. But well, where did it come from? What do we mean? We talk about housing. Well, we actually talk about land. Land is where most of what the thing, as you've said, is the thing that's mostly unaffordable. Well, what do we mean by land, right? For sure, in an agricultural economy, you do mean things a bit like soil and irrigation and all those things. But generally speaking, in a modern industrialized economy, in most places, what you mean by land is location. So the system we're talking about here is the system of how, as a society, do we allocate location, right? That's essentially what it is. And the roots of that system, they basically go back to, in England at least, we can broadly trace them back to William the Conqueror. Of course, he himself was then using a thing that had already been developed through Frankish kings and Romans, etc. Right, but the essential principle was, as William the Conqueror, I've just conquered England. I now have a problem, which is how do I rule over this country without keeping a standing army, which standing armies are really hard work and they tend to turn against you and they're expensive, and without having organized bureaucracies, right? Because today governments have big systems of bureaucracy. And the answer was kind of genius, right? The answer was a piece of paper. It was says, right, what I will do is I will nominate some people who will be called lords or dukes, my mates, and I will say, here, you turn up with an army anytime I need it. But in exchange, I will grant you your own personal fiefdom. Within that fiefdom, you can tax people as high as they can bear to pay. Now that tax is rent. So rent is the original tax, right? That's one of the things I think people often don't kind of grasp about this, is that it's a form of tax. But over time, what happened is that effectively that tax became privatized. So because if you are a medieval king, well, as I always say, staying within the domain of medieval king problems is like not like first world problems, is even more niche than first world problems is medieval king problems. Who are you scared of? If you're a medieval king, you're scared of other medieval kings, your own family, and your nobles, right?
It's a good point. Yeah.
Right. So, and that's why at various times nobles were able to extract various concessions. One of them is the Magna Carta, for example, in which they could say they limited the power of kings, and then over time they gathered more power in the Parliament around the kings, right? So you had the House of Lords, which was like the really powerful, and then of course you brought in commoners as the next layer down, who were so they and then carry on through this kind of continue. Essentially, the political history of the UK can essentially be best told through the prism of land power and the way that landowners then the degree to which their power is increased or tempered. So the like the Reform Acts, a lot of the things that Reform Acts we think of as people getting the vote, but actually when you look into them, a lot of it was to do with like, could your landlord send someone to see how you voted? Because the landlords obviously were like, oh, how did you vote? Did you vote the way I told you to? Okay, guess what? You're getting evicted. So effectively what happens over time, and of course you get the acts of enclosure, and the acts of enclosure was a huge deal because essentially people who had access to common land said no, and that put that kind of completed the monopoly that the landowners had. So effectively over time, what the landowners did, the landlords did, is they managed to extract a series of concessions out of kings, and effectively in among those was, oh, by the way, as king, as government, we want you to raise taxes directly on people and businesses, but by the way, leave us with these taxation rights called rent. And that's how essentially they became privatized.
Okay, I
So
see.
right now, fast
Started
forward, and
negotiating, yeah.
right. So what
Everyone
that,
was
I mean,
becoming
this
a
is all. I'm
powerful in
sure.
themselves. Yeah.
I'm sure a proper historian will say I'm making all sorts of gross oversimplifications, but I think this is a reasonably uncontentious sort of broad brush painting of
Yeah.
the arc. And what's interesting therefore about this is that you recognise that rent is tax paid by the poor to the rich, right? In it, effectively, what you have when you buy a piece of property is a piece of paper issued by the state, and that state gives you the right to tax people up to sometimes half their income, right? For nothing, for just not evicting them, right? And this is what Adam Smith was writing about in chapter 11 of The Wealth of Nations, about how this works, the law of rent. And effectively, that's what gives those pieces of paper such huge financial value, right? So when you're buying a piece of land in Mayfair or wherever else, you're not actually buying that piece of mud. That piece of mud existed long before us and will exist long after us. What you're buying is a piece of paper where the government says, if someone messes with your right to enjoy this land, people with truncheons or potentially guns will turn up to defend it. Right? That's essentially what property is. Fast forward to today, those pieces of paper represent over 80% of all the wealth of the UK. And more, depending how you account for it, well, more, somewhere between 50 and 60% of it is just the land piece, not even the buildings on that land. So this is really funny because people sometimes jokingly say that the UK is actually just a really big property market with a small economy attached, which is a funny joke, but it's also
Kind of
basically
is.
statistically true. Like if you look at every year, the ONS publishes this thing called the Blue Book, which is like an account book of all the wealth, of various forms of wealth, and gold and all the shares in all the businesses.
Weapons, I think, are another
Yeah,
part of it
weapons,
at the
all of those
moment.
things. Yeah, for sure. But all of that stuff is this tiny thin layer on top of it. The big
Okay.
bulk of the cake
Yeah.
is land, because land gets to tax everybody, right? If you buy, like,
Yeah.
that's the whole point. If you got
Yeah.
land, you get to tax everybody, or you get to buy land in order to buy your freedom from taxes. And that goes back to what we were talking before about power, right? Why this is all about power. Because I
Yeah.
was to say, when you see those adverts for building societies or whatever, and there's a young couple popping champagne and they've got the keys to their new house that they've just bought, what they're celebrating is not the fact that they bought that specific house. What they're celebrating is the fact that they just leveled up, right? They just bought their way out of this. There's basically three layers in this class system, right? Which is people who have no land at all and have to rent it at one end. At the other end, there's people who have so much land that they can afford to not only own the land underneath their own bed, but also own the land under somebody else's bed. And then in the middle, you've got homeowners, which is people who've got just enough money to, if you like, buy your freedom from the rent tax. In other words, you've got enough of a lump sum capital sum, what's called imputed rents, essentially formed together into a big lump sum, and you go, cool, I've bought my freedom from that. Now, of course, the desire to buy that freedom is so great that you will borrow as much as you possibly can to make that leap. And that's where the mortgage industry comes in, right? So the big explosions in property prices that we saw during the 2000s were very, very heavily driven by the widespread availability of cheap mortgage debt. Because why wouldn't you? Like if you could borrow, and another analogy, a good way to think about this is, if someone you love had a disease and that disease could be cured by a pharmaceutical drug of some sort, how much would you pay for that drug? Well, as much as you have, because you want to keep that person alive, and that person wants to stay alive.
It's not a
And then if
fixed
someone's
price. It's yeah.
right,
It's
but then if
infinite.
someone then came along and said, right, I will lend you money so you can afford that drug,
You'll find
then
the money to pay it.
right, so they could set the price. The price they can charge is set by however much you can borrow. So property is basically worth however much somebody can borrow to try and get their hands on it. And that's why there's this coupled relationship between the availability of debt, of mortgage debt, and obviously house prices, because people are so desperate to, you know, um, to
Put
kind of
down
level
roots.
up. Yeah, or just to buy the basic right to be able to put down roots. In other words, to not be evicted from a home, or to not have your deposit kept for putting blue tack on the walls. And what I
Yeah.
find funny about this is that, going back to where we started, like, nobody thinks this is an okay system. Adam Smith didn't, Winston Churchill didn't. So whether you're left or you're right, no one thinks this is okay. It's no one's fault, really. Like, this is just like this buggy bit of leftover feudal code
Hmm.
that just stayed in the operating system, and we just never got rid of it.
Yeah.
And what's funny is that we kind of spend so much time arguing about its symptom, trying to manage its symptoms, and arguing on the surface of things, because it's so. But underneath it all, there's this kind of basic bit of weird feudal code that's still sitting there, and we don't quite know how to shift it.
Um, I do find it refreshing to understand the complexity and that it is nobody else's fault around the housing crisis. But personally, I feel a responsibility that when I do have access to solutions
Mm.
that can be implemented, and when you have the kind of skills to understand something like the planning system, you
Yeah.
know, architects have these skills. We can understand these legal frameworks that we're operating within around housing. I do feel a responsibility to put out those solutions and unapologetic to start demanding more from our politicians who have
Well,
failed.
okay, yes, but let's go further than that, right? Because politicians too are just people within a system, right? So I don't, I if so, for example, I used to be a landlord, right? I don't think I'm an evil person. I was just in this system, right? But let's extend the same measure of generosity towards politicians because they too are in a system. You know, the biggest donors to the main political parties in the UK are the property sector. Is the biggest donor.
But I think you can tell when someone is working in integrity, and if they are telling people that this thing is okay, that they're working on it, that there's more houses coming out into the market, that it's okay, that they're doing better than last year. There's never a kind of an admitting, well, actually, maybe we don't
It,
have this. Maybe we need to actually kind of figure this out. You never see that. And I don't, that does really annoy me. I don't see that as true leadership. I guess they have to compete. The competing is only going to go so far.
there was, I agree with this. There are definitely, yeah. I get really fed up with when you see like political leaders keep coming out with the same, oh, we're going to build more houses and it's going to bring prices down. Well, A, how are you going to build more houses? Because if you don't understand the system, that's not going to change. And B, really, where are you going to build them? How is that going to bring prices down? Because there's a whole bunch of reasons why that doesn't happen. So that said, there have been, so actually weirdly Michael Gove was one of the first secretaries of state for a long time who actually got a lot of this stuff. He described, it's in the context of the leasehold scandal, he used the word feudal to describe our existing system. But it's really difficult to shift politically, even if you know that, because, and it's not just to do with party donations, it goes back to the thing I said earlier, which is no one's going to vote for your house to go down in value. So the interesting thing about this system, right, is that there is
Yeah.
actually one pretty straightforward solution. It's not very often. I would say you should always be suspicious of people who say there's one silver bullet solution, because to these deeply complex problems. But in this domain, there's something that's not far off, right? Which is Henry George's solution, which is land value tax, right? Which you basically say, well, if land rent or the imputed version of it, land price, is a tax ultimately that we pay anyway,
Yeah.
but we pay it to the wealthy. Why don't we pay that tax to the public? Since, as Churchill articulated in a brilliant speech called The Mother of All Monopolies, it's the public, and Adam Smith did as well. These are not left-wing figures. That it is the public that create that land value, right? So there's a famous quote: "Streets are made, water is brought thousands of miles off the hill, roads are made, and all the while the land monopolist sits still."
It's the people that
You know,
create the location value,
right? So
what makes
really
places
straight.
great, and they fund the infrastructure through taxes.
Exactly right. So really straightforward example I use all the time is schools. So we know that if you're in the catchment area of an Ofsted outstanding school, it's going to add something 50, 80 to 100k to your property price. And yet we tell ourselves we don't pay school fees, for example, if you send your kids to local grammar, but you do pay school fees. It's just you
Yeah.
pay it to the property system instead of to the school. Now, if even half of that money was going to the actual school system that was creating that value, every kid in Britain would be in a class size of 10, right?
Yeah.
So so there's a kind of there's that basic thing. So Henry George's idea is land value tax. It basically says what we do is we tax land value instead of taxing people's income and enterprise, right? So instead of
Yeah.
taxing your labor, etc., etc., and how far you want to take that is a debate. But
Yeah, and
essentially
there
you
actually are examples of this been done in Ireland where they wanted to incentivize rural regeneration. So
right.
they basically gave people huge tax breaks on their income so
Yeah.
that they would encourage them to live and build in rural areas. There's examples
Right.
of this.
It's a good point. It's
It's
a way
been
of doing the
done,
same. Yeah. But of course, the problem with that is that then
the income side
afterwards
of it.
it does pick up, and whatever, right? The land values pick up, and they keep the land values.
But I think it went wrong actually. There's one example in Ireland where loads of developers started to get in on it.
Right. Right. So
But
right.
in a,
You
but
know,
essentially, I think it's good to at least to have
these are the
uh,
dynamics exactly at play. Yeah.
to have precedents of at least aspects of this new land system that is possible to bring
Right.
in that can solve
Yeah.
the housing crisis. So essentially, create a system where people can access a plot of land, and what they pay for that plot of land, it gets regenerated into the
Back into the
infrastructure
location value that
of the
creates that
place.
location value in the first place, and that is why we can solve things like the north-south divide, right?
Yeah.
Because actually, when a piece of land, say in London, costs £500,000 at least, right,
Mm-hmm.
for a house, um, a chunk of that should be going back into the local community and local infrastructure and services that created that locally. But also, you could be taking a chunk of that out of that overheated market and putting it elsewhere to invest into amazing schools, for example, in Hull. And guess what? Like,
Yeah.
houses will be building themselves. So
Yeah.
in Hull, so fundamentally, yeah, like once you get that basic principle that land value is location value, and location value is created by everyone and by investment in infrastructure and services, then you can do it. It also works for the whole country, by the way. Like, how do you fund defence? Well, it's in everybody's interest to fund defence from land values, because your land ain't worth nothing if the Russians take over. Right? To choose an extreme example.
It's
So,
important. Yeah.
right. So defense is the foundational service that you're paying for, right?
Yeah.
Um, so squaring that circle, and that's what Henry George advocated for, and really, really popular. Winston Churchill tried to do it and Asquith tried to do it in 1909 in the People's Budget,
All
and it got
right.
killed in, guess what, the House of Lords. So this is where we have the issue, right? Which is, we could
Yes.
turn around to politicians tomorrow, and there were lots of Georgists out there making this case, saying, "Hey, we should do this." In fact, not just Georgists, very respected economists.
Mm.
There's the Merley's review, which was a review of how taxation worked in the UK, said actually we should be shifting more towards this. So,
But they're not getting anywhere.
well, no, because fundamentally, right, I suspect we will go there slowly and gradually, right? But if you actually applied a land value tax really well, then by definition, the purchase price of a bit of land would be zero, right? So a piece of land in Hammersmith and a piece of land in Huddersfield would both
Yeah.
cost you nothing up front, but the one in Hammersmith would have a much higher um, community ground rent or land value tax. Yeah,
Yes.
because you're paying for access to a
That's
really
a very high level kind of analysis of it, in
well,
a
it's
way.
because it's so I'm saying that you're paying for a very popular location, right? But so what
Yeah.
I'm saying is that if the exchange, basically, because the tax is, when you're buying a piece of property, you're buying a bundle of rights, right? Now, if you then tax that, you're also buying a liability to say, hey, by owning this bit of land, you're you're getting a bunch of rights, which is the right to live there, etc. But you're also taking on a liability, which is the obligation to pay the land value tax or community ground rent, whatever you want to call it. So by definition, these things will balance out. So if you're doing it right, they'll balance out, and your land values to buy and sell will be zero. So
Mm.
when you buy a property, the only amount you'd be paying for would be the residual value of any buildings on that land relative to its neighbour, right? So by definition, what I just said implies that if a government came in and properly implemented a land value tax tomorrow, property values would be largely wiped out.
Do you mean
Now,
to introduce that across, all existing?
yeah, right? Because
Yeah,
if you
seems
think about it,
crazy to
I
do
just
that.
said that 50% of the private
Yeah.
wealth in the UK
Yeah.
is land. So effectively, you're saying, oh, right, all that would go down to zero. Now, don't get me wrong, you've now got all the public wealth you need to do everything 10 times over. But politically, how popular do you think that's going to be?
And even
Not.
infrastructurally, or having the services to do that kind of a transition, it wouldn't It
Right.
wouldn't
So it's
work at all. It would be a
right.
disaster, wouldn't it?
So you
Too
have
much change too quickly.
right. So in a way, you could argue it's also perhaps a little bit unfair to expect our politicians to just go down that route either, right? So I think this is where we need to do a bit more work.
Okay.
And uh, so the good news is there is another way, right? So we have to accept that we all have a vested interest in that system, and you might go, oh, right, we're screwed then. But the good news is there is another way for the public or the community in general, whatever scale, whether it's the local community or the national community or the global community, that there is another way for the community to capture land values, and that is buy the land, buy the underlying freehold. And this has
Yes.
been pretty proven, right? This is how Singapore works. So Singapore is often held up as this sort of thing, like a paragon for kind of a free market world. But what's often not mentioned is how do they do that? How is it possible in Singapore that income tax is as low as like 15%? And the reason, and yet they have very little housing crisis. They have fantastic public services and infrastructure. I'm not saying everything about
With
Singapore is perfect. I'm just saying
fantastic
that,
public transport.
right. How do they do that? The reason why they do that is because the state owns the freehold on all land, and it issues leases on the land, right? So
So
basically,
the costs of, so what people are paying for their apartment, usually they live in
yeah,
apartments in Singapore, that's going back
essentially
into
the
the
value of
government
location is
infrastructure.
going back to government, yeah,
Yeah.
and that means that they don't need to
As
tax
opposed to
people's
out to
income
some
and businesses.
private landlord, which is not getting regenerated back.
Correct, right? So they're closing that loop, and that means
Yeah.
they can leave people with more money in their pockets. That's how
And
they're
I
doing
mean,
that, right?
I personally, like, I'd love to start implementing this on a really small project, as in like one or two homes, maybe just one or
Right.
two. And I think that would be like a really lovely thing to do. Not
And
just
that,
from,
by the way, the good news
and
is, as
test
we
and test
know,
it.
that's
You're not going to
that's
harm
already
anyone.
exactly, and that, by the way, is where we're at in the UK because that's already happening, which is around the UK. Whenever they've been able to, community land trusts have been forming and buying land. So effectively, when the community land trust comes in and
Hmm.
buys land, it's a way of saying you could say the land, the underlying freehold belongs to the community, or you could simply say it's a way of saying the land kind of owns itself in a way. The location owns itself.
Yes. So the
Um,
community land trusts, do you know any examples of them actually reinvesting in infrastructure? Like,
yeah,
what kind of
all the time.
infrastructure?
And
Or is it kind
so
of more like does it
obviously
become a gated community, or is it?
it can be anything. So in a way, what community land trusts then do with with the land, that's a whole separate interesting conversation. And the answer is, which maybe we come on to, loads of really interesting stuff. Surprise, surprise, they tend to make more affordable homes, lots of great community facilities, etc., etc. Because it tends to be more local and they're working within such narrow margins, it tends to be just local stuff, right? So what they're usually doing is actually keeping housing affordable in the first place rather than capturing its full possible market value and then recycling all that money. But then then the money that they are capturing, they're then reinvesting into local infrastructures. But look at, for example, Cornwall community land trusts are really interesting because it's a network community land trust. In other words, they recycled some of that money to then buy more land.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's now Cornwall CLT have there are multiple neighbourhoods through Cornwall and hopefully growing. So
Yeah.
that so this is a really interesting thing because it goes to your thing about we can start to build. This is a more politically viable way to change this system
Yeah.
effectively, because rather than thinking, oh, look, we can do this through political reform alone, we can do this more slowly by effectively slowly buying out the old land system. But
Yeah.
then this creates this really interesting set of questions and challenges, which is how do we drive that? How do we encourage more of that? How do we support that? Okay, what are the
Yeah.
new institutions? So one of the things I'm sort of, and many others have argued for, is a national community land bank, which would be a financial body
You said
explicitly.
decentralized land bank.
Well, it could be, yeah, in the way that then
Decentralized sites, but
it,
connected
it, correct, yeah.
nationally.
So a national institution that supports local communities to effectively buy out and become the stewards of land.
Yeah.
And that could become a rolling with a, an upfront endowment, that become a rolling institution. That would be a really powerful move. Um, the There's lots of things that can be done in planning, and organisations like the National Community Land Trust network
Yes.
are working on all these things. The thing that we're particularly interested in, is backstory. If you're listening to this, Neve and I worked on a project called the Atlas of Ownership, where we began to pull together all these fascinating examples of different types of ownership and stewardship from across history and geography. And so what's really interesting is that the community land trusts, having got hold of the land, and the community land trust movement, it's got its own interesting backstory, which comes from the civil rights movement in America. But having got their hands on this land, they begin to think of new fair ways for people to own homes. And so one of these is a form of fair, affordable home ownership, where you can own a home for less, but only as a place to live, not as a financial asset. Now, we think that should have a name, and we call it Fairhold. And that's a really useful standard, a pattern, because lots of people, including people who already own their home today, go, "Oh my God, I would love that. I would love one of those. I would love to have more money back in my
Sorry to
pocket."
interrupt, but this
No,
is
please.
basically an implementable solution to the housing crisis that can be done at local level without, kind
Yeah.
of national political action.
Absolutely right. But don't get me wrong, it needs national and political support, but it can happen right now, and it is happening now. We need to shift from seeing it as a slightly weird thing that's happening in the corner to
Yeah.
no, this is the main way we are going to tackle the biggest issues facing us and our society and our economy today.
And I think if a local group of passionate, committed citizens come together, this is something that they can feasibly achieve
Yeah, with great difficulty, by the
without
way.
waiting for their favorite political party to come into power or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's empowering.
Yeah, and here's another thing you could do with your podcast would be to go around and speak to every single one of these communities who's actually managed to do it. And the story is usually the same, which is they've only managed to do it through unbelievable toil, blood, sweat, and tears.
Well, to be
Right?
honest, I just want to start implementing it myself. I'm too impatient. I've done enough research. I want to start implementing a model in the next year. Like, I'm actually tired of research. I want to take action for myself as well, to create my own home. I'm not paying £2,000 a month for renting some shitty apartment in Athlone. Like, it's not like Athlone is not like anywhere like London. There's no creative industry.
For me, one of the interesting ways into this movement is that everyone agrees in principle with the idea of community land ownership, as an abstract idea. And everyone agrees in principle with the idea that there should be more affordable homes.
Yeah.
But as you said before, this system is governed by incentives. So something really, really interesting happens when you switch from the idea of housing opinion to housing demand, where this is not just a kind of a nice thing that people support, right? It's actively something people demand for themselves.
Yes. And I think once there is a clear example where I can get a plot of land for a reasonable amount, maybe we can discuss that cost in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at Wikihouse here. Wikihouse is one of Open Systems Lab's main projects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for €35,000, I can build a 40 square meter, which is studio flat,
Yep.
the bare chassis.
Yep.
Okay, you can get a
Definitely.
5-year loan, monthly repayments, €730 per month.
Yep.
Pay that off in 5 years.
Yep.
Right, so that could be a decent. Okay, you still need to add in case services.
Yeah,
And
I mean, and this is, by the way, is one of the things
electrical services and things like that.
Yeah, this is also one of the opportunities of self-build, is of doing stuff yourself, is you don't have to do everything at once, right? So you can reduce your exposure to debt, because you say, look, there's some certain essential things we need to do now, which is make the place safe, make the safe habitable, etc. And this is also to do with the way the finance and the mortgage industry works. But actually, yeah, for sure, there's lots of things that, what, we can come back, we can do that later. Or also we can grow the house. So you could start off with quite a small house and then make it larger later as and when you need to. And of course, that's something that, Wikihouse is designed to facilitate.
But instead of paying £2,000 a month, which is currently the rental costs in Athlone, in my hometown right now, you can pay Okay, let's say it's £1,000 per month. Could we say £1,000 in euros to €1,000 per month to get a plot and a basic chassis, which a
Yeah.
watertight insulated chassis? And look, we can clean our own. We can. There's loads of sheeps and loads of sheep, so well, we can sort out our own
Yeah.
insulation.
Well, I mean, so for sure, but the
In terms of
price of
getting
the
loans, it needs to be certified.
for sure, right? Some well discuss, right? And I was actually over speaking to someone in the Caribbean. That sounds ridiculously luxurious, doesn't it? I was speaking to
Sure,
someone in the
yeah.
Caribbean
My
recently,
brother lives out
and
there.
they told me about this brilliant thing called susu. You can go and look it up on Wikipedia. It came out of Africa originally. Again, we sort of we should come back to this kind of interesting back to the future historical nature of how much we can learn from how much these modern innovative models are echoes
Yeah,
of old
it's a
indigenous
whole thing. It's a whole
models,
other
right?
story.
It's
Yeah,
definitely a thing.
yeah,
Um, which you say we saw a lot in the Atlas, didn't we? But this is a finance model called Susu, which is basically where it's like a mini building society. So what you do is you have a club of people and you all put in a certain amount for a certain number of months, and then 1 month, say it's 12 people for a year, you all put, say, £100 in every month for that year, but then 1 month it's your year and you get 1,200 whatever. Yeah. I can't do maths, but
that's
you know what I
really
mean. Yeah,
cool.
it's good, right? So
Well, there's something
it's
like that happening at the moment now. Like there's a family in Ireland and they're kind of Irish speakers and they're basically crowdfunding so they can buy their house. And
yeah,
everyone is supporting them. And it's like, what if
yeah.
a bunch of
If
people
you did
decided
that in
to
a
do
circular
this?
way, yeah.
You had
So I
enough
mean,
people that
you
bought
got to
into this
remember
idea.
that in the
Yeah,
grand scheme of human history, since humans were walking around on two legs, the idea of for most of that history, the idea of usury, charging interest on loans, either didn't exist or was forbidden by religion, right? So and then the religions kind of got a bit more relaxed about that later. So they had to find some way to do some stuff. They were, admittedly, don't get me wrong, financial systems, they do help stuff happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, but actually there are other ways to do it. So that's one. I mean, someone listening to this might go, oh, well, that's kind of basically a building society, because it is effectively building societies with slightly extended versions of that, where you have savings. But it was very common in the sort of turn of the century thing. You'd have these building societies that would come up, they would form, everyone would build their home, and then the building society would disband at the end, right? So
yeah.
once everyone had their home. So these are definitely financeable models. To go
And do
back
you
to your
do you
question
sorry,
before.
do you sorry to interrupt again? Do you see these kind of emerging business societies, building societies? I think they were a common thing for a long time in Ireland as well, but
Yeah,
they fell away a little bit. Would you see
yeah,
them connected with something like Wikihouse or connected with the
yeah, yeah,
community
yeah,
building
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
as
yeah.
being
And
quite essential in that instead of using like to design a new building society or to work with an existing
yeah,
bank?
we would love. So this is one of the things I love about our work. We would love with in that space, pursuing things like projects like Wikihouse and projects like Fairhold. We'd love to have more opportunities to sit down with folks in the lending industry and say, actually, let's design some new stuff, right? Actually, let's look at what kind of new lending products you could create to
Yeah.
to bring the to bring to design these sorts of models, because there's so much that's possible. Yeah. So come back to the thing you said before, though, which was, well, what about the land value, right? So here's the trick. Here's the killer, which is that what is land worth? And Adam Smith articulated the answer in chapter 11 of The Wealth of Nations, which is land is worth whatever you can afford to pay for it. Because by
Essentially, it can be
definition,
a negotiation.
well, it is a negotiation, right?
It is a
Because
negotiation.
although often sometimes a one-sided one, but the effectively, um, like if it's a piece of paper, right? The value of a piece of land is nothing to do with what it costs to produce. This is what Adam Smith says. He says it's nothing to do with what it costs to produce, because it didn't really cost anything to produce. It's a piece of paper, right? It cost a few pence to produce a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Um, uh, it's actually determined by your ability to pay, right? So if you have a property market where the person who gets a property is allocated by whoever's the highest bidder, then that is what determines its value. So, and this is the case
In
of
the
any
market
what's
right
called a
now, that's
rentier, yeah, a
yeah.
rentier good, right? So this is why the word monopoly, the game Monopoly, there's a whole other history there, but the that's why we talk about the word monopoly, because what you're getting is monopoly over a particular bit of location. And so it's price determined what you can pay. Now the issue then depends is, well, what's its price? It might depend a bit on who's selling it to you and on what terms and for what reason, right? So
Yes.
let's say you came up with a clever way of using Wikihouse or something to build yourself a house, and you go, wait a minute, cool, I can build my house a lot less. So instead of costing me £2,000 a month, it's going to cost me £1,000 a month.
And I
Well, a
don't have to
clever
have
price,
I just don't want to have a landlord's shitty furniture around me.
for sure, right? But what I
But
mean is
yes,
the moment you realize that, right? The moment the landowner realizes you realize that, they can now charge more for the land, because you can actually
yeah,
bear, and to use Adam
yeah.
Smith's word, you can bear to pay 2,000 because you have been, right?
If I
So
can
what
get
they'll
a
do,
loan, if I can get a loan to finance Wikihouse, is this
eh,
possible?
well, for sure, yes, it is. But the point I'm making is that if tomorrow, imagine WikiHouse made it easier for you to build a house for less money. It made it easier for everybody to build a house for less money. All that would happen is that land prices would go up. All goes back to land, because landowners are like, oh, you can afford to pay more then. I'll have that, right?
Yeah, but I need to negotiate some cheap land, so I'm not going to give all
Right.
that away.
So this is why it's so important that we get the land
The land is
into the
of a
hands
person.
into the hands of an organization who don't have
Mm.
an incentive to just maximize its financial return. And the way I often put it is, just this is the most hideously complex, wicked problem in the world, in my view. But at the heart of it all is a quite simple question, which is, as a society, do we want land or location do we want to see the land and underneath our feet as a financial asset from which we want to extract the maximum amount of money, or as a platform upon which society, the economy, and the environment run, right? If we treat it like a financial asset, then we want its value to be as high as possible. Whereas if we treat it like a platform, in the same way we would think of clean water or broadband internet or
Yeah,
anything else, we want its cost to be as low as possible, because we basically say, well, the less you have to pay on clean water, the more money can be in the rest of the economy, going and doing great businesses and great enterprises and all this kind of other stuff, right? So,
yeah.
and fundamentally, it's either one or the other. It can't be both.
Yeah, and look at I don't I'm kind of not really interested in trying to convince people who want to benefit from the rising land values to live a different to think differently. I
Yeah.
feel like there's only so far you can go with that. It's
Yeah.
quite entrenched, and I think it's more effective to start focusing on people who really need to see an alternative solution. So I think people who are kind of in their 30s, in living with their parents, who really
Yeah.
want to have their own place, like you really need to get potent on it. And
Yep.
if you can solve it for them, and also there's actually been a new planning law that's brought in Ireland actually in February 2025. So basically, anyone who has an urban plot with a home already on it, essentially
Yeah.
someone with a decent sized garden,
Yeah.
you're exempt from planning from building a 40 square meter dwelling.
Yeah.
So this is a really good opportunity.
It's the same as happening in the States. Yeah. So it's a
This is a really
really
good
great
opportunity to kind
opportunity.
of
But the
test some of
question
this
is,
stuff.
Neve, what happens then? Right? Because if that plot is just a conventional freehold plot, that new thing you create, well, the reality is you will get a shortcut into having a cheaper home. Good, bully for you. But the next generation are screwed again.
Well, I'm
Because you,
thinking
when
more
you
to
come
do
to
a
sell it,
lease.
you'll be like, actually, okay, whatever though. But in any case, if you can sell it for the maximum you can sell it for, then
Yeah.
naturally you're going to want to do that when you do that.
Well,
So what we're
I'm kind of a
what
little bit inspired by Airbnb in terms of, okay, how do we actually, create a platform? This is not solving the world's problems right now, or solving the whole housing crisis, but this is actually, how do we solve this problem for a very small demographic of people who need to move out of their parents' house
yeah,
and who don't. Okay, so essentially we need to kind of start matching these landowners who have this property with the planning exemption on it and, plot seekers. So we create some kind of a platform, or even if it's rewriting letters by hand, you connect these people together, kind of like Tinder. Okay. And maybe they need to kind of get some benefit out of it as well. So maybe if you can get some decent investment This is
Okay,
connected to the shareholder deal.
I get you. Yeah, this is all
The
fine,
community
but what?
organisation will buy the plot and hold the freehold and lease it
Right.
to the
And
homeowner who'll
that's the
build
point that
their
that's
little
the point I'm
fort.
getting at, right? And so this is exactly what we can make have been doing in Bristol, which is the key thing is you don't want to
Yeah.
just do it where the land stays in the ownership of the existing people because they're like, well, they're gonna rent it for you, or you don't want to have a freehold because you say one generation get a lucky break, but then
You're not really
after that
changing the system at all
you're not
there.
changing anything, right? Whereas the actual opportunity of these densification projects, and I'm absolutely with you on them, and have
Yeah.
been sort of advocating for the similar sort of models here as well, is it should be coupled to what we call fairhold. So a model like this, where effectively, exactly as you say, the underlying freehold gets parked into a community trust, and
Yeah.
then a lease, which is yours for as long as you want it, then becomes you. So the
Until you
owner of that
die.
new 40 square meter home effectively owns it. But there's a couple of limitations on that piece of property. One is that when you come to sell it, you can't sell it for more than the amount of you paid for it, adjusted for the base rate of inflation and any improvements you made, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you buy that plot for €1,000, right?
It would be
Um,
great.
wouldn't it be cool, right? Imagine that. Okay, let's go a bit more. Let's go a little bit more. Let's say €10,000. And let's
Yeah.
say you spend 150, no, let's say 50, why not? Let's do the thing. 50,000 euros building a thing. Your property
Really
should then be
fancy
worth
caravan.
it should be worth 60,000. You shouldn't be able to then flip it and sell it for 500,000, right?
No,
Right. So you want to have that clause locked in there,
of course. Yeah. Yeah, we
right?
didn't really go through that in this, but that's a given. But yeah, essentially we're
Well,
redesigning
it's not a
property
given. It's not a given. And that's why Fairhold, that's why we're doing Fairhold. Because actually,
for me
and then the other thing
yeah.
you want is that we think is another key thing is to make sure that we're suggesting with Fairhold that
Yeah.
if you rent the property out, any amount of rent you earn, which is above the level of social rent, has to be shared back to the community as well, right?
But I'm thinking of really testing this out this year. And I feel like, okay, if I just can do this for one person, for just me,
Yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah,
and okay, but I think to ask, even if I can convince someone to let me live in their garden in, say, like a really nice caravan
yeah.
for 3 months, and
Do
I
it.
can get to know them, and then slowly, then we can start to talk about transferring.
You're making this sound really creepy now. I feel like you should probably
No,
say
but I
up
feel
front
like
that.
like people need to know who their neighbours are to really genuinely, the social side of it
Yeah,
is
that's right.
important.
I
You know
think
what I
that's
mean?
no, no, absolutely right. I think that
They need
connection
to
is
feel
important.
comfortable with who's going to be living in their garden, essentially. Okay, we're going to be
Yeah.
building a fence. That's going to happen. And we're going to have nice gardens. But,
But it will, for going back to your platform idea, so that's the interesting bit is to say, well, actually, how many people out there would say, actually, I'd be quite up for this, whether it's doing it for my kids or whether it's doing it for an amount of money um, that they get bought out for, say, 20,000, 10,000, 20,000 euro or whatever. Like, cool, yeah, that's great. That's going to help me with my retirement or whatever.
but to build a
Um,
platform where you can start to gather the data, how many landowners and how many plot seekers would actually be into
right,
this?
right. It's yeah, exactly, just connecting people. I mean, honestly, go for it because this, I think, this is the way we do it. But the important thing is to actually tie it to those models, like the
Oh, well,
Fairhold
look, if
model. Say,
that's the
and
whole point, is to implement the
right,
model. That is the whole
right,
point.
exactly. Well, it's not the whole point, right?
I
As
mean,
you
I
say,
could just you
it's a
could go to a
win-win, though, right?
campsite and
Because
to put a
yeah,
fancy tiny home there, but that's not really
right.
changing anything.
Right. And that's
The
the
whole
point.
point is to
Point is that you
implement the
can
model.
house, exactly. You can house, and what we mean by implementing the model there is you can house a whole generation of people so much better. And by the way, what you're doing is solving it not just for one generation, but also for the next generation, for the next generation.
And that we're implementing a model that can be replicated.
Exactly.
Like, I'm
So,
not going to
and
live in a 40 square meter thing for the rest of my life. Jeez, I hope I don't have to.
exactly right. And
In 10 years' time,
the
I'm going to need a bigger place.
exactly. And the
So that
exciting
model
news,
has,
by the way,
yeah.
is like these models exist. So we haven't invented Fairhold. The work that we've done on Fairhold and researching it has been just going out and learning and taking bits from all the different stuff that's already being done by community land trusts and by various municipalities around the world. What's really fascinating to me about this is that the more time I've spent working in this space, the more I realize that actually people's common sense of values and principles are remarkably similar, despite the huge amount of potential division in the vested interest side of this conversation. If you
Yeah.
put a load of people in a room and said, in abstract, say, we're about to go to a new planet, what would be the best way to allocate land on that planet? Actually, and you're not allowed to come out of the room till you all agree on something. Actually, it doesn't take that long before a certain common set of principles begin to emerge, and
Yeah.
people form around them. And that, I find that an amazing source of hope and inspiration. That
Yeah.
actually, whether you're looking at these indigenous models from Ireland, from hundreds of years ago, through to somebody doing something innovative in Almere in the Netherlands, I was like, oh God, look, it's the same principles that keep showing up again and
And
again.
this is so funny because I recently put up a very short video on a YouTube channel I just created about Brehon law and communal land ownership and how that can inspire solutions
Mm.
today. And somebody commented it really kind of aggressively that they were like, "Are you part of some NIMBY organization?"
Yeah,
And it turns out then I replied to him, I was like, "No, I'm told him a little bit about
yeah,
myself."
yeah.
And then he got really nice with me. He's like, and he's actually from someone who kind of was really beating down what I was talking about. He actually is he's part of a housing association himself in America. And,
Mhm.
we're on the same team, but we get caught up
Yeah,
in these stupid divides.
exactly right.
And
And
these silly
this
terms
is
like NIMBYism and all that, they're not specific or nuanced enough to really talk about what we're really talking about. But we all really want the same thing. We all really want, to live in a community that's healthy, to have, be able to look after our families, to have a nice home, to not worry about putting food on the table and housing ourselves, maybe go on a holiday, enjoy our life. We all pretty much want that.
exactly that. Well, here we are. We've just spent an hour yakking. I was yakking on and on, but you've just said the best bit of this whole conversation, right? That is basically it.
And let's
And
focus on creating
this
that, getting the
right.
housing, get our
and
housing
and it
sorted
and
first,
it takes a
and the
step,
land.
right, where, because as you say, I'm always quoting this. There's this paper for the Government Office for Science that said our housing debate is bedeviled by rival oversimplifications, right? Exactly what you were saying, right? These false tribes that we're all caught up in, these like YIMBY or NIMBY, and they don't make sense. They're completely bullshit categories. And actually, as you say, if you can get past them, and it takes a certain degree of patience and time and spending time together and actually talking, and you get beyond that and you realize that once you get past those, we're all broadly amazingly aligned on
Yeah.
what good looks like.
And apart from maybe someone like Donald Trump, but I kind of feel like even if someone is really angry and amped up about something, I think behind that there is a lot of good, and there's probably they probably really care about something.
Yeah,
You know,
all of these things are the surface, are the surface expressions, or the surface symptoms, whatever you want to call them, of something underneath that's broken, right? It's a load of people angry, and a load of people with having too much oligarchical power and so forth, right? But the really interesting thing to do is to not worry too much about all those surface expressions, and actually get to the thing and say, what is it underneath that's broken, and can we fix it?
yeah, and that's I think really important to keep getting curious, not get bogged down when we're not seeing change, and when things
Yeah,
are a bit of a disaster around us, to kind of stay curious, because that's what actually helps us to create new innovations and new solutions.
exactly. And what you said earlier, which is, that thing about, you know the Buckminster Fuller thing about don't fight against the existing system, build a new one that makes it obsolete. Like, finding little pieces of a new, better system that we can implement somewhere right now, in a way that's replicable, is the single most powerful thing you can do right now.
The building and the creating of a home is it's a universal thing, isn't it? And it
Mm.
really it unites us all.
Yeah, there is nobody who doesn't need a place to live. Point is, if I think the essential, the historical reflection is, for a long time we've built this whole economy, a whole society, where a whole branch of activity was based on the fact that a load of people, it wasn't easy, it was expensive and difficult just to have a place to live. And I think hopefully we're now, as we look at all these threats and crises coming in the next decades, I think we're now at a point where we go, do you know what? If not now, never. Let's actually start saying that the economy and society will be better off if the starter for 10 was that everybody can, at least at some basic level, get a place to live.
Yeah, it's almost like in the face of these crises, it's like it forces us to focus on what's really essential, like food, water, a home.
Exactly.
And
Basic
just really focus
resilience.
on that. Because without that, what's the point of like
Yeah,
really high GDP or whatever, you know?
exactly. Yeah, basic resilience. And actually, if we can get the basic resilience right, we can save ourselves so much money, so much pain, and also genuinely build a quite prosperous economy. And I think that's the thing on this, is like, if right now you are really interested in the idea of creating an abundant, prosperous economy, fixing this problem should be top of your list.
So what would you advise someone to do if they were in that kind of position right now, if they really want to try and work on this stuff? Just to finish up.
Well, I
What
think
kind
you.
of advice?
I mean, I'm not going to hand out advice because, as I said, I think, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And if anyone has made it to the end of listening to this conversation, hopefully they either already had seen this or now they see it more than they saw it before. Hopefully, it's not just been completely incoherent. And what you then do with it is up to you. But I like your thing about saying, actually, you know what? Look around where you are. Where do you want to live? Is there a way to unlock a thing where we can get a bit of land into this new model, which in some form or another means that the land itself is parked into some form of community long-term stewardship, and then people get a place to live.
Yeah, and I think a lot
And
of the
that
great
benefits
examples
them, it benefits the local economy,
Yeah, and even like one of my favorite examples of this, one of the best examples, is the Nightingale maps. I just think they're amazing. But yeah, Jeremy McLeod, the co-founder of that, he was an architect. He wanted to create a nice place for himself to live as well, and his partner is also an architect. So I think when people have a really, really direct incentive is in like creating their own place as well.
Absolutely right.
There's nothing more powerful than that. When you have the skills as well, the skills are important. But when people really want to kind of invest, and you're always seeing, all this talk about investing in whether it's crypto or pension funds or God knows what you're investing into. But really, what's more important than investing in an actual community and the place that you live?
Yeah.
That's
And I mean,
tangible investment.
I showed the Fairhold paper to Dan Hill, and he on the show he gave loads of really useful guidance and things. But one of the things he wrote was he called this fantastic phrase a judo move. He said, "This is the judo move at the heart of this, which is that to go from where you go, we're locked into this system that none of us agree with simply by our own self-interest." Right. If you can then find a way where, as you say, you can use your own personal self-interest to unlock our way, harness that to unlock our way out into a new system, then that's the judo move.
And just before we go, there was something that I really wanted to touch on. We didn't get a chance to, and you work in this kind of cross field of a kind of architecture and software development to create these new technologies. And I was kind of getting really annoyed. Well, kind of the other day about Airbnb, and I was thinking, but Airbnb is so effective as a platform at connecting, landowners or homeowners with, their potential customers. And the really interesting thing is I was looking into the origins of Airbnb. I think it was in 2007, around the time just before the crash. These two guys needed to pay their rent, right? Actually, the Airbnb comes from air mattresses. These guys, they needed to pay their rent. They're living in San Francisco. People were finding it really hard. They were coming to these fancy conferences, software conferences in San Francisco. They couldn't find a hotel.
And the prices were through the ceiling. Yeah.
But they really quickly made a platform. Basically, they thought, okay, maybe people would be up for having breakfast and sleeping on an air mattress in our living room. We're solving an existing problem here with a very kind of a small demographic.
Yeah.
And I find it really inspiring. Like, obviously it's grown into its own beast, but it reminds me of something like
I mean,
private property is a creative
I've got,
force, and
I'm,
also
I'm,
Airbnb is a creative force. You know, both
I'm,
technologies.
yeah, I'm not uncritical. I'm almost entirely pro on Airbnb. By the way, there's an even brilliant one called Fairbnb, which is exactly what you think it
I've
is. It's
looked
like
into it.
Airbnb, but
Yeah,
yeah, but yeah, I think I mean I broadly think Airbnb is brilliant because also as a middle class person, even if I got rich, right, uh, I wouldn't really want the hassle of owning a second home. I don't think, and because
the
Airbnb
hassle of it.
exists,
Yeah.
instead of all these fantastic places, I can just go and stay in places for a week. And yeah, no, I think um, it's a brilliant demonstration of the power of platforms and the power of yeah, finding those cracks in this silly system that can unlock kind of better utilization, and actually you get better experiences, you have a better life. Now
And what
obviously,
they
you know,
did really
Airbnb
well
does
was
that within the
connect.
very narrow realm of travel and holidays, but actually I think what you're saying is, and I think it's right, which is, well, we the same principle could apply to all kinds of things which go deeper into longer term living.
Yeah, but in that kind of culture of experimenting and trying out an idea,
Yeah, yeah.
using this amazing web technology that we do have.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's the thing, right? As we were going back to where we started with architecture, is that, for heaven's sake, don't stop designing. Like, design more, be more inventive. It's just that the way we're gonna solve these issues isn't going to be designing buildings one at a time.
and this is the Cedric Price architecture. Yeah, this could be seen as a form of architecture.
I would argue it is. If you go back, right? You know, there's
But Airbnb is
as
probably doing more for architecture than the
that's
RIBA.
and that's that. I mean, discuss. I mean, but yeah, I agree. They've certainly, yeah. So the exactly the point, right? Which is, if you uh yeah, if you go back to that original charter, it's like it's all to do with people in the built environment, right? And there's no set limit. And so along my career, as I'm sure you've probably encountered this a bit, and certainly through my architectural education, there was no shortage of people who'd say, "Oh yeah, but that's not architecture." I'm like, well, on one
Yeah,
level,
there's so much of that. I once really introduced a friend
who
to
cares?
Wikihouse at a dinner party, and
Right.
she went mental. That's not architecture.
Yeah, right.
It
But I'm
ruined the
like,
whole night, actually.
I'm sorry, I ruined your dinner party. Um, but I mean, partly the answer is, well, who cares? If it's useful, then great. You know, it's a good thing. But but
The
also,
culture of it, the culture of it
yeah, but
is
also more
entrenched.
than that. No, all of these things, it is architecture because, as I said, like when you go back to the original purpose, the original founding charter of architecture, nowhere does it say that you have to be drawing buildings or designing buildings for rich people. Like there is no limit to the number of ways and things and that you could do pursuant to that ultimate end goal, which is improving society's well-being in the built environment. You know,
It's a
and
good
by
definition of what architecture is.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay,
on that
Alistair.
note, we really should go.
Yeah, thanks a million for this.
No plan survives first contact, and the problem is now you have more editing to do. But anyway,
No, it'll be
sorry
good.
about
It'll
that.
be good. It'll be good. But I mean, yeah, I think it's hard to kind of make stuff really kind of to make something in a very short space of time is difficult to talk
Big
about really
time.
complex things.
To get it into a story or a proposal or a specific thing that embodies all of those details. So you don't need to talk about all of those details and all those principles, because the thing you're proposing embodies them.
Yeah, but that's a whole level of craft. I
That's-
don't think
yeah,
I have.
I'm well, same here. However long it takes you to do that. Was it famously said, "I wanted to be brief, but I
Telling
didn't have the
stories,
time."
narrative, and all that. Hmm?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can't remember who it was who said, "I wanted to be brief, but I didn't have the time." It takes a hundred times longer to get it down into something so
But no,
condensed.
seriously,
Anyway,
my next goal is to find a plot, a 40
do
square
it.
meter plot for myself, and I think I feel like I need to embody this kind of stuff beyond the
Yeah,
intellectual. That feels like
yeah.
the next
And
thing to
also
do.
it's a very powerful way to tell the story, like to do it for yourself.
Yeah.
You know the story. Did I tell you the one? There's a book by a lady in Cornwall who lived in a shed.
Yes. I
Yeah.
actually met someone who was related to her when I
Oh
was in
right, that's cool.
Portugal in a surf camp. Yeah,
Yeah,
apparently she's quite an
but
intelligent woman. She's yeah,
oh, she very, very like that. That's
yeah.
the genius of it. And I feel like
She has
there's a if you
yeah.
could do that, you could do the same thing, right? Which is the sort of you tell the story of the land system through embodying an alternative to it.
But also been able to help other people do it and guide them along and do it. Do you know what
Yeah,
I mean?
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
it doesn't feel like it's that far away. And I've talked to lots of
Not at
counsellors in the
all.
council, and they're all kind of like, Jesus, you've got some great ideas, like come and help us, kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I
Well,
keep I
that's
went
it.
for
Come on, let's have the first fairhold in Ireland. I'd be very pleased with that, especially because I'm hoping that any day now I'm going to get an Irish citizenship. So I'm going to also
why
be,
why is that?
yeah, I'm also going to be Irish. Well, because my grandfather was Irish, and I'm afraid it's
Oh,
a bit. I'm afraid it's a bit one of these mercenary things of like because I still feel European and I'm clinging to and I want to be European. It's not just practical. I'm not immediately going to use it, but in spirit, I want to
and
be
would you give up your
European, and
British
so.
passport, or will you have the two
No,
of them?
so the British are ridiculously spoiled because we're allowed to have both.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
can be both British and European, which is what I am, and also a little bit Irish,
Oh, that's
at
cool.
least by
That's
descent. So
cool.
yeah,
No, it would be
there you
great to
are.
have a
So
fair hold.
that would be an amazingly cool thing if we then, for me personally, if we then got a point where the first fair hold was in Ireland.
It would be great. I think Ireland would be great. I think the Irish are really ready for this, to be honest. You know? But the
Let's
but the
see.
fair hold would have to be owned by a community organisation.
Well, that's it. Yeah. So this is one of the debates we had: is how flexible should you be about who can be the freeholder in a fairhold model? But actually, could it be a council or whatever? I won't go into all the legal nuances of it now, but the short version is, the best model is some kind of community trust.
So like a social enterprise, or does it have to be a
Yeah.
particular type of
So
community structure?
so I don't. You have to look into what it looks like in Ireland. In England, don't know if this applies across the UK. Certainly in England, there is a legal definition now that's recognised, which is a non-profit organisation primarily focused on the holding of land and assets for the benefit of a community, and that is accountable in its governance to that community. And anyone in the range of that community can apply to be a member. So of it, and therefore have a voice on it. So there is those aren't the exact words, but something like that. So,
Yeah.
but it's a within that the exact legal instantiation can vary, and I'm sure there'll be people out there who can Google it and do it. But it's a trust is a totally incorporable thing. It will absolutely be. There'll be very standardized ways to do it in Ireland, I would imagine, to set up a trust. So it's
Yeah.
basically the organization has a
Interesting.
lock on its assets. So the community have a voice over how it's governed, but they can't mess with
It's
its asset
very difficult
locks.
to move that asset around. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
definitely
So
lots of trusts
basically,
established in Ireland already.
yeah, yeah, and you can have those asset locks built into its articles of incorporation, basically. Um,
So Fairhold, if say you set up a private company, Fairhold isn't
yeah.
legally compatible with that.
Um, well, no. So we thought about it, but we said no. Like it's better,
Okay.
and especially unless it can be absolutely proven otherwise, it's by
Hmm.
far the best thing is have the next case after community land trust will be a public body, but the danger of a public body is that it's exposed to the vicariousness of democratic politics. In other words,
Yeah.
the residents of the homes could all club together in 30 years' time and put pressure on their elected representative to do a freehold enfranchisement. In other words, to flip them all. Um, so it's a way of protecting them from that as well. So we've suggested, community land trust should be the thing, and then what fairhold actually is essentially a template or pattern for the leasehold agreement that is between the community landowner and
Oh,
the individual person. So essentially, that's what a fairhold agreement is. It's an agreement between a freeholder who wants to act, who's a community landowner, and an individual or
leasehold.
family. Yeah. So it's essentially it's a standard pattern, a standard template leasehold agreement.
Leasehold. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Lovely
Okay,
speaking to you,
thanks so
Neve,
much.
and
Yes, I'll
best of luck.
yeah, I'll update you if there's any updates, hopefully in the next few months.
Cool. Yeah,
Thanks a
don't
million,
put
and
anything too embarrassing. I hope cut out all the really embarrassing bits, won't you?
I'll do a bit of editing, and I'll send it on to you, and I'll do a proper intro and everything. I'll send it on to you before it's released, but this is very early stages of the podcast. But yeah,
Lovely.
thanks
Yeah.
so
Well, good luck.
much.
Let's go. Cheers.
Bye.